All right, we're ready for Judges chapter 4 in our study tonight. Judges chapter 4. And we looked at Judges 1 and 2, and then last week at chapter 3. And so here's our outline that we're looking at throughout the book. Three major sections to the book as outlined here: apathy, apostasy, and anarchy. In chapters 1 and 2, we saw the apathy as they are finishing. There's the task of the challenge, at least, of driving out the remaining elements of the Canaanites in the land. They didn't do too well. There was a divine rebuke because of that. They failed in that. And this serves kind of as a summary of not only the book, but it also serves as a foundation of why the rest of the book happens like it does, is because they didn't do their job to start with. So the apostasy starts in chapter 3. And we saw three judges in that chapter. We saw Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. We want to say more about Shamgar in our study tonight. And Ehud too, because they are, one is mentioned and the other one is skipped over. And we'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment. We're ready to look at Deborah. And she is listed in chapter 4 and in chapter 5. And then Gideon is listed next. This outline mentions Barak as being one of the judges, or as if he were one of the judges. I think not, but we'll talk about that and whether he was in a moment. Then there's the third section of the book, and that is anarchy. We'll look at this each time to remind us of this principle that the cycle starts and it goes over and over and over again. And history repeats itself. That's one of the practical things we learn every week, is history does repeat itself. Israel starts out serving the Lord, and then they fall into sin, and then Israel is oppressed, and then they cry out to the Lord. God raises up a judge. They are delivered, and then they start serving the Lord again for a number of years. And then it's a little while, and they start the cycle over again. So with every judge, however many judges we end up looking at, that's how many times the cycle in this book they went through. So here's chapter 4 now. Question number 1 is list the judges. This shouldn't be hard. If you missed this one, then we need to start over. List the judges that are mentioned in this chapter, or that are dealt with in this chapter. There's actually 2 judges mentioned, but what judge are we talking about in chapter 4? Deborah. If you missed that, then go back and start with chapter 1. Technically, there are 2 judges that are mentioned here, and that is Ehud and there is Deborah that is mentioned. Question number 2, what nation oppressed Israel? The Canaanites. And then let's get another question out of the way. Question number 4, how long were they oppressed? 20 years. We're not told in this chapter, but if you're interested and want to underline or mark or note how long she judged, that's not mentioned until we get to the end of chapter 5. But jump on over to the very last verse of chapter 5, and how long did she judge? There's peace for 40 years. All right. All right, here's what happens in chapter 4. This deals with Deborah as being the next judge. We've had 3, and I'm encouraging you, even though this is an adult class, we don't normally work on memorization. Try to memorize the judges so that when we get through, you can go through Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, and Deborah, and keep going. And so Gideon and on down the line. So far we've had Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar. We'll talk about Shamgar in a moment. And now we're looking at Deborah. So 3 things that are happening in the chapter. God raises up Deborah. God raises up the judge. That's one of the points we made in our last study, is that God will raise up the judge. He doesn't just volunteer a campaign for that, and by popular vote, whoever selected, then that gets to be the judge. But God selects the judge, and this time he did. He selected Deborah. And then we're going to see that she calls for Barak, and he is the military leader. That's why some list him as one of the judges. We'll get to that in a moment. And then we're going to see the battle itself. Now, chapter 5 gives us some information that's not told in chapter 4 about this battle, because that's Deborah's song. Now, I don't want to get ahead and study that, or we won't have anything for next week. We'll already shoot everything for next week. But we are going to have to make some references to chapter 5 to understand some of the things in chapter 4. So if you haven't already read your study or lesson, we'll be making some reference over there and you'll see why that's the case. All right, let's talk about God raising up Deborah. Let's start at verse 1, and it says, when Ehud was dead. But I thought the last judge to be mentioned was Shamgar. And it was. So why didn't the text say, you think it's in sequence, Othniel, Ehud, and then following Ehud is Shamgar, and then following Shamgar becomes Deborah. That's not necessarily the case. Shamgar seemed to be a more localized judge in the sense that he dealt with a more localized problem. There's not much said other than what we have at verse 31. That after Shamgar, and after him was Shamgar. So Shamgar came to the scene after Ehud. But then it says after Ehud was dead, then Deborah is raised up as a judge. So it seems that Ehud, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah are more nationwide judges in the sense that they are leaders of the nation, whereas Shamgar seems to be a little more localized. Seems to be the case. I say seems to be. I'm not sure I can prove the localized thing, but I just pass that on for what it's worth. Now, chapter 5, this is where one of the places where we got to jump ahead of ourselves. He seems to be a contemporary with either Ehud, that is, I'm talking about Shamgar now. He's either a contemporary with Ehud or Deborah. Because chapter 5, and chapter 5 lends the idea, some think it was the previous, but chapter 5 seems to lend to some support that it's overlapping with Deborah. So let's look at verses 5 and 6, and we'll go to our timetable. That in the days of Shamgar, now she's talking about this victory that she has just led in. That's what the song is about. This is Deborah's song. So she says, in the days of Shamgar, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted. So here was the situation as she begins to lead. So, and she mentions the days of Shamgar. So which was it? I'm not sure. But let's go back to a timetable that we've been looking at each time. Below this line, we have the oppression. So we had the Mesopotamian, Moabite, and Philistine, and now we're going to look at the Canaanite. And now Deborah comes. Well, Shamgar, notice that he fits in right here, that Shamgar is listed here as a co-regent or a contemporary with Ehud. Others move him over and put him as a contemporary under the leadership of Deborah. And chapter 5 may lend a little support to that idea. I'm not going to argue that point because I'm not sure I can, where he fits in exactly. And who was reigning at the same time, I'm not sure. So let's go back now to our outline of, that's not the one I want, of verses 1 to 5 and talk about God raising up Deborah. So when Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, the text tells us. So this 80 years that we've just finished, you say, where'd you get the 80 years? Let's go back to verse 30. Because I'm going to skip Shamgar. Not that he's not important, but whether he fit in under Ehud or fit in the period of Deborah, I'm not sure. But the text begins by just simply saying that after Ehud, then here comes Deborah. All right? That being the case, we've just finished 80 years of rest and peace under the leadership of Ehud. For what it's worth, that's the longest period of peace that we're going to read about in the period of the Judges. There's going to be some other periods, long periods, 40 years under Deborah. But this is the longest and the last of that period. There will never be another period of 80 years in the period of the Judges, for what that may be worth to us. So that's the longest that the people have enjoyed. Now verse 2, so the Lord sold them in the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan. Now in the land of Palestine of the time, there were city kingdoms. And what we mean by that is we think of a kingdom as being a whole region. And maybe one is a king over all these many cities, but there would often be a king of this city. Remember, Melchizedek was king of Salem. Remember that? He's king of what became known as Jerusalem. So here's a king that was the king of, according to verse 2, of Hazor. Now we'll talk about whether that's, let me go ahead and identify. That's not the same Jabin that was killed by Joshua in Joshua chapter 11 100 years before. Not the same guy. He was king of Hazor. Hazor had been destroyed. Hazor had been burned. And the Canaanites have rebuilt it and regained some strength because they are allowed and tolerated to live there, so they've kind of gained some victory. So now they are the oppressor and have control of Hazor and of other cities. And so Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. So why is he reigning in Hazor? And it's some translations I understand word it that he's king of Hazor, but he's also king of Canaan. It seems, of the Canaanites. Well, it seems like maybe that he was a king of that city, but he may have been leader of a confederate of kings. So perhaps leading a number of other kings as they are oppressing the people of God, according to verse 2. Now, let's go further. At verse 3, he was oppressing them. Now, verse 3, the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron. For 20 years, he harshly oppressed the children of Israel. For 20 years, that took place. So what I've seen so far is the Lord allowed the Canaanites to oppress them for 20 years. And then we're going to see about God raising up Deborah. That's what I want us to see, God raising up Deborah. But why were they oppressed for 20 years? This was a harsh period of 20 years. Hazor has been built up during this time, has become stronger. Perhaps a confederate of kings have band together so that they are oppressing the people. But notice again the wording, they harshly oppress the children of Israel. Now let's go to chapter 5 to see how bad things were. This is Deborah's song, and she's painting a picture of how tragic and terrible it got to be during this 20-year period. What does she say? Well, but at verse 6, in the days of Shamgar, that's either contemporary with her or maybe just before her. Either way, it's talking about this time period. The highways were deserted. The travelers walked along by the byways. Village life had ceased. It ceased in Israel until Deborah arose a mother in Israel. They chose other gods. They chose new gods. In other words, you look all around and life for the Israelites had become desolate. They're being controlled and oppressed by another nation. They were supposed to have conquered this land and then driven them out so that they controlled the land, but now they're being controlled by the people they were supposed to drive out. And so it was a harsh oppression. Let's go further. Look at verse 8. I'm in chapter 5 now, just trying to paint a picture of how bad it was during this 20-year period. They went after gods, and then there was war in the gates. Not a shield or a spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. Now, when this battle took place, that we're going to read about at the end of the chapter, prior to that, now there's two interpretations given of chapter 5, and we'll talk more about this next week, of what verse 8 is saying. Some said the Israelites had weapons, but they hid them so that they couldn't be seen. So that the Canaanites didn't take them from them. I don't take it to mean that. I take it that their weapons were gone. They really didn't have, now they may have had some weapons, but basically, with poetic license, she's writing that you look around and the weapons are all gone. There's not a weapon around. They have 900 chariots of iron, and with 40,000 men in their troops, they still don't have enough weapons. We're going to make a point about that a little bit later. I think the latter perhaps is the case. You may think they hit them and had plenty. And so be it. I'm not sure I can prove one over the other. So let's look at verses 4 and 5 now. I'm just trying to paint a picture. This was a devastating period of 20 years. This was not an easy 20 years where they just had to ride out somebody else being in power. This was a devastating 20 years. Now, verse 4, now Deborah, a prophetess. Now, this is interesting because we're in a period of time among the Jews that was true even by the New Testament times, where generally, not exclusively, we're in a male-dominated society. Whether it should have been or shouldn't have been is not the argument. Whether you would like living in that society or not is not the argument. It was a male-dominated society. And so God raises up a woman to lead. Why a woman in that environment? I'm not sure. Some speculate because there was very poor male leadership as they've gone off into idolatry. Perhaps so. Men weren't stepping up to the job. That may have been the case. I don't know. I don't know what you're learning tonight. You're learning that there's a lot that I don't know about Judges 4, I think. But anyway, let's go further. That there was this prophetess, meaning that prior to her becoming a judge, she was a prophetess. That meant she was inspired of God. She spoke the will of God. She revealed the word of God. God's speaking through her. And she indeed is a prophet. She wasn't the only one. There were many other prophetess. Miriam was a prophetess, you remember, even earlier. And she would sit under the palm tree between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim, and the children of Israel would come to her for judgment. Now, this judgment has to do, I think, with civil or judicial type of judgments where there are issues and problems. She's a prophetess, and they're coming to her for judgment. I think judicial, yes, but also because she's a prophetess, then they're coming to her for revelation from God. What's God say on this question? So you picture her being a powerful leader among them because she is directed by God. She can pass judgment in issues they have, but she's also directing them, this is what the word of the Lord is. And so she's the natural one that God's going to raise up for this. So Deborah was raised up. God chose her. Now let's move on to verses 6 to 9. Deborah calls for Barak to come. And let's see what she does and raise the question as to why. So verse 6 and 7, she calls upon Barak to fight Canaan, to fight against Jabin, as he's leading seemingly a confederate of kings. Come and fight him. So let's see what happens here at verses 6 and 7. She sent and called for Barak and said to him, has not God, the Lord God of Israel, commanded, saying, go deploy the troops at Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and sons of Zebulun. Now we'll come back to verse 7. What did she tell him, and what did he learn as she's come to Barak? And she says to him, what she says. What did she just tell him? What did he learn? All right. He should have learned from this, and George is exactly right. God has chosen the battle. And God has chosen one to lead the battle. God has told me to tell you, you're the man to lead. What does that remind you of? Remember God telling somebody, you're the one to go lead my people. Moses. What was Moses' reaction? Hesitant. Reluctant. What kind of reaction did Barak have? He wanted her to go with him. He's a little reluctant too. Now let's look at that. So what I want you to see, she's a prophetess, which meaning that this is a direction she's saying to him, God has spoken to me, and I'm paraphrasing. God has spoken to me, and God has said we're going to fight against Jabin, and God's told me you're the man to lead us. That's what God told me. Now verse 7. Here's what else God said. And against you, this is God speaking, I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army. Here's something practical. We're going to list these later. I just learned something from verse 7. God said, I will deploy Sisera. Does that mean God is on Sisera's side, the Canaanite side? Going to use them. So I learned two things here. God sometimes can use people that are not godly people. Can he do that? Did he not use Babylon to punish his people? And Babylon was far worse in sin than his own people. And so God's going to use Sisera for something. But it also tells me that God allows things that he does not cause, but the Bible pictures it as if God caused it. Remember Matthew 6, the text says, lead us not into temptation. Well, if God can't in any way lead us into temptation, why pray that? Because it's impossible. Well, what it means, lead us not into temptation, it has to do, God leads us in the sense he allows it. God allows us to be tempted, but he doesn't cause it. Because if he does, that violates the principle laid down in James 1. So God allows a number of things that he doesn't cause. God may be allowing things today that you wonder how in the world. God didn't cause it. God allows that to happen. One may be temptation you're struggling with. And so God's going to allow this to happen. God's going to allow Sisera. So let's go back to verse 7. I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and the multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into his hand. So what Barak should have learned from that is God's chosen a battle. God's chosen me as the leader. That's why some think he's the judge. I really think he's leading under the leadership of Judge Deborah. But do what you want to with that. So God's chosen a battle. God's chosen the leader, and God's chosen the victory, and God has said it's going to work. Just listen and it's going to work. That's verses 6 and 7. Now let's look at verse 8. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Now some commentators kind of say, well, I understand why he said that. That's kind of like saying, I understand Moses over here saying, I don't think I'm. When she had just told him by the word of the Lord, God chose you and God will give you victory, what should have been his response? To accept it and go. If God's telling me through this prophetess that I have victory, all I got to do is just go do the job and it's going to work, then I need to go do that. But he hesitated. Now, why did he not want to go without her? I don't know. Here's some speculation for what it's worth. Some have wondered if he wanted her to go, being a prophetess, just in case he needed a revelation from God. That he might consult God. What does God want me to do now? What does God expect of me? Or what would God... But I have a problem with that a little bit, because what has he already got from verse 6 and 7? He's already got the outcome, and he's already got, before the outcome ever happens, the what? The way, yeah. The instruction. You just go fight and I'm going to give you victory. And sometimes I'm wanting more from God. I'm wanting more instruction, and God's already given me all I need. Hadn't he? I want to know more about how I'm going to take the gospel to somebody so it works. God's already told me how. Make sense? Maybe I'm waiting. So I don't know. Maybe he was wanting a revelation from God. Some have speculated that I want you to go with me to help me enlist. We've got to enlist some men to go fight. And you told me to go get 10,000 men. Could you go with me and help me, since you're a prophet, enlist them in? Maybe that was it. I don't know. But whatever reason, he was hesitant. What was her response to that? All right, I'll go with you. Nevertheless, there's not going to be any glory for you, but the glory will be given to a woman. What do you think Barak is thinking? Who the woman is? He's thinking it's Deborah. But we've read ahead and we know we fast forwarded to the end of the movie and we know who the woman is. Who's the woman that's going to get the glory? Jael, verse 21. That's the woman. So what we have here, there's two things I want to point out about that. One, that was a prophecy. She's a prophetess, so she's given a prophecy. I mean, how does she know when the outcome of this battle is going to take place, that it's going to be a woman get the glory of that? How does she know that even if she were talking about herself, which she's not, that she's going to get the glory? Because she don't know, boy, she might get killed in this battle. But she knows because of the revelation of God. She's a prophetess. But there's another thing we've already talked about. In the midst of a male-dominated society, that's humiliating to this military leader. That I want to go, but I want you to go with me. Come on, go with me. And all right, I'll go, but I'll tell you what, you're not going to get any glory for being this leader. A woman's going to get the glory out of this battle. And so they go. All right, more about him and her and his hesitancy at the end of our study here in a moment. But you might mark verse 9 being a prophecy. Now, beginning at verse 10, now that gets us through verse 9. So Deborah calls for him to come, and he said, I'll go if you go with me. So let's talk about the battle now and the time we have left. So what we have in verses 10 to 24 is the picture of this battle that took place and the details of the battle. Now, there's more details of the battle that are given in chapter 5. Again, that's next week. But we're going to have to steal a little thunder from next week to have to appreciate some things in chapter 4. So let's start through the battle beginning at verse 10. Barak came with 10,000 men, according to verse 10. So Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kedesh, and he went up with 10,000 men under his command, and Deborah went up with him. So he's the leader of those. Now, I'm not going to steal every piece of thunder from next week, but if you're kind of interested in going ahead and just kind of peeking over to chapter 5, if you've forgotten some of this, that starting about verse 13 of chapter 5, it talks about rallying other tribes to go besides these two that are mentioned here in our text at verse 10, and that is Zebulun and Naphtali, his home territory of Naphtali. There were other tribes that joined in the fight. There was Ephraim and Benjamin and Issachar, some of those. But then there were other tribes, there were at least 4 tribes that refused to go. And they weren't going to help in the fight. So he comes with 10,000. Actually, there were more that were added to that we'll talk about in our next week's study in chapter 5. But we'll stick with this 10,000 for right now. Now, at verse 11 through 13, and on a cursory reading of this, you wonder, why is this even mentioned here? But look at verse 11. Now, Heber, the Kenite, who was a descendant of the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent at the terebinth tree, which is beside Kedesh. That is close to where the battle site's going to start. Why did he separate himself? Well, we're not told. Some think and speculate, and again, this is conjecture, that he may have, well, let me get ahead of myself before I give that answer. Verse 12 says, and he reported to Sisera that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor. So he seemed to have some connection and relationship with the Canaanites and knew Sisera and had some dealings with him. And some have speculated, okay, here's what he did. He defected over to the Canaanites and had turned his back on the Jews. I don't think so. Others say, well, he had shown, he was trying to, because this is a torn, I've got my people here, but then there's the battle with the Canaanites. There's a divided spirit here, and he's trying to maintain some middle of the road position, maybe for his own business adventures. And maybe it was to his advantage to have some favorable relationship with the Canaanites while at the same time trying to be a Jew, but he moved away and sat over here closer to where the Canaanites were. I don't know why, but he seemed to have some relationship, and that's going to become important. All right, let's go a little bit further now. Verse 12 says he went and reported to Sisera that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor. Let him know they're coming to battle with you. They're going to fight you and try to stop this oppression. He let him know. Now, interpret that as you wish. I'm not so sure that means he's defected, and I know I'm rehashing what I just mentioned. I'm not convinced of that, but you may think he defected. Okay, maybe so. Or it may just been that he was trying to draw some peace between each one and trying to get along with everybody. All right. So now, verse 13, Sisera had gathered all of his chariots, 900 chariots of iron. The picture of 900 chariots of iron is to give a picture of a mighty army. They're not just foot soldiers, but they have chariots. They can move with speed, and they can kill and move on with speed further. And they have 900 chariots of iron, and all the people that were with him, and they came to the river, and they're ready to fight. All right? So that gets us down through verse 13. Now let's take 14 to 16. He slaughtered Sisera's army, but Sisera escaped, verses 14 to 16. Now, we're not told some information here that we're going to have to pick up from chapter 5. Let's get 14 and 16. 14 to 16 now. But Deborah said to Barak, up for this is the day the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you? Here she's giving divine assurance. Remember who she is. She's a prophetess. She's giving divine assurance. This is what the Lord has promised. This is what the Lord has said. Don't forget that. And so he went up, the text says, to Mount Tabor, and with 10,000 following him. Now, where this battle basically took place, let me take a moment to go to a map. We've got time to do that, I think. Where this battle took place, basically, is at Megiddo, in that region of Megiddo. There were many decisive battles. And that's why we talk about Armageddon in the book of Revelation, is because Megiddo was the place of many decisive battles, and this is one of them. It's taking place right in that region, is where this battle is taking place. Now let's go back to our outline at verses 14 through verse 16 and see how we just got verse 14. Now, the Lord routed Sisera and all of his chariots. Now, that's interesting. That word routed, anybody have a translation uses a different word there? I'm at verse 15. And the Lord routed Sisera and all of his chariots. Anybody got a different word there? Confused. That's what I'm looking for. It has to do with the Lord confused them. It means literally, as that footnote, what translation? New American. It means to throw into a state of panic. And so just a cursory reading of the New King James, which I'm using, gives the impression that the Lord just, and that would be victory, he kind of rounded them up into a region. But the idea of the Lord routed them, he confused them and threw them in a state of panic. Now, how did he do that? Well, let's get ahead of ourselves. Let's steal a little thunder from next week. So let's go to chapter 5, verses 4 and 5. What did the Lord do? This was a battle that we can say basically it was, some have suggested it must have taken place somewhere between April and September, because this was not typically the time something would normally take place. That obviously happens here. Rain. Not just a little rain. This was a frog strangler. It was a downpour. Notice at verse 4, the clouds poured water, the heavens poured, the earth trembled, and the heavens poured, and the clouds poured water, and the mountains gushed before the Lord, this Sinai before the Lord God of Israel. So what's the point? You don't take your chariots of iron into a battle when it's going to rain, because what happens? Mud and mire, and they bog down and they're useless. In fact, not only are they useless, they are detriment to you in the battle. And so they're going out to battle in a time period, apparently, where it's not a time of tremendous downpour. Well, why did it rain? God had promised them victory, and this is one of the ways that God routed them. God confused them. Now, why would it confuse them? Well, two things. One, they're surprised, because it's not the time for rain. They wouldn't have done this, say, in November. They would not have done this in the winter period, but they did this, as some have suggested, somewhere between April and September. And so just putting it in our day and time, this is August when it's dry and we're ready to go out with our chariots of iron, and all of a sudden there's a tremendous downpour to the point we can't roll our chariots of iron anymore. They're serving Baal. Baal was thought to be a god of the weather and particularly of storms. Now, what do you think they think about their God? Well, our God's let us down, because our God ought to be controlling us, controlling this for us, and if he's giving us rain, I'm wondering now if maybe their God's stronger than our God. They're confused. They're thrown in a state of panic. And so the Lord routed or confused them. Might put a marginal note if your Bible doesn't have that. God confused them. And Sisera lighted from his chariot. What did he do? He fled away. Barak pursued the chariots and the army, and all the army fell by the sword, and there was not a man left. So they basically, how were they able to slaughter them? Now, I think I can harmonize in my mind the depletion of weapons in chapter 5 and this victory here, because you could have 900 chariots of iron and all the soldiers well armed, and maybe have a few swords, over here among God's people, and with God being with you, you could easily slaughter these men as they're trying to escape from their chariots and move on. So verse 17, he pursued them, and not a man was left. Now let's begin at verse 17 now, through verse 22. Sisera fled to the Kenites. Now that's why earlier we saw something about the Kenites. There's a favorable relationship there. Now they're among the children of Israel, but they've been favorable to the Canaanites. Sisera fled to the Kenites where Jael killed him. So let's get this picture 17 to 22. And then we're going to bring this to a close and look at some practical things. I've lost my place. Verse 17. That Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber. Now, I don't know for sure, but some have thought that, unlike perhaps our day and time, people don't think anything about how things appear. But for a man to go into the tent of a woman would not be thought the thing that he ought to do. And some have speculated Sisera felt like, if I go into her tent, nobody's going to come looking for me in there, because they would think I wouldn't go into the tent of a woman. I don't know if that's the case, but that may have been that's part of his disguise. But he went to her tent, and not for immoral purposes, but he went, and she had invited him to come in and told him not to fear. And to turn aside, and she covered him with a blanket. He asked for something to drink. She gave him milk, the text says. Kind of some interesting details. But now, verse 20, what did he ask her to do? All right. Yeah, you stand at the door of the tent. You covered me up with this blanket, or the footnote to say rug. Covered it up as if the rug of the tent that would be laid down is hiding him. And tell them, if anybody comes asking, that there's not a man here. Tell them, no, 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 no. So then what did she do? Women of that day were typically the ones who would establish and set up the tents as they would go. And as one author said, she would have been well equipped to use a hammer. She knew how to use one. And she knew that, and she knew it well. And I want to stop for a moment before we talk about exactly what she did. This was a wise woman. Why do I say she was wise? Some commentators spend a great deal of time talking about, was she deceptive? Did she lie? Did God approve of that? Did she commit murder? And did God approve of that? One thing that I thought one author said about this was quite interesting. This must not be interpreted in light of New Testament principles laid down by Jesus for Christians. This is a story of what happened. I'm more interested in the storyline as to whether she did right or wrong in that. But I do think she was a wise woman. And you say, why do you think she was so wise? She had to conclude when she saw Sisera coming that, number one, he's fleeing from battle. She knew he was a leader of the Canaanite army. And as he comes running, she has to know he's fleeing from battle. She has to conclude without him even telling her that if he's fleeing from battle, the Jews are winning, wouldn't you think? And she has to conclude from that if the Jews are winning, the Canaanite oppression is soon to be over. She has to conclude, if the Canaanite oppression is soon to be over, if I protect him and hide him, that's not good for Israel, that's not good for me. And so she brings it to an end. And furthermore, she doesn't have a clue to our knowledge. She was wise, but there is no indication she had any idea that she is doing something else in light of verse 9. She is blank, blank. Fulfilling prophecy. Who said that? You get the smiley face. She fulfilled prophecy. She doesn't know she's fulfilling prophecy, evidently, but she does it. So she takes this peg and drives it through his temple and drives him to the ground. And so that when Barak comes, she said, there's your man you're looking for. She got the glory, didn't she? She got the glory. Now let's finish up that chapter, and we've got time to list a number of practical things. Israel grew stronger and subdued Jabin and the Canaanites. because of this victory. They slaughtered the army, they slaughtered the leader, and then verse 23 and 24, the Lord subdued Jabin, king of Canaan. And the hand of the children of Israel grew stronger and stronger because they're fighting against them, and they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. And now, what's chapter 5 about? Well, chapter 5 is going to be about the song of victory. And we'll talk about that next time. And we got time to look at a number of practical lessons. Some of these are quite interesting to me. One of the ones that's not on the screen before you, let's start with that one first. I'm learning there is a difference in reformation and restoration. I learned it in this chapter, I learned it in the last chapter, I'm going to learn it in chapter 6. There's a difference in reformation and restoration. That as soon as the leader dies, that means the restraint is gone, they quickly go back to sin. In other words, the change they're seemingly making is restoration, meaning they're not being restored in the heart, because if they're restored in the heart, that lasts longer. But restoration has more to changing in the outward form. They change in the outward form because they're restrained because of their judge. But as soon as the judge dies, they're ready to go back into sin. And so the question is, when we turn from sin, are we reforming? Or are we being restored? Here's some other things. History repeats itself. God uses nations, even evil ones, to punish other nations. God could use this nation to punish another. Could God use another nation to punish us? He sure can. He sure can. God hears the cries and call of His people. Number 4, God allows things He doesn't directly cause. In other words, there may be things going on that you raise a cry. How could God let this happen? Well, how could God let Sisera fight against His people? God, the text says, God, I will deploy them. It means He allowed it. God has a purpose. There may be things going on right now. You think, why did God do that? God didn't do it, but God may be allowing it because it may be accomplishing something He wants to accomplish that I don't see. Whatever that may be. Number 5. I want to get 5 and 6 if we don't get any others. This is interesting to me. Some are reluctant to do the work God appoints them to do. When God says, you can do it, here it is, here's the job, here's the task, you can do it. And some are reluctant and says, I'm not sure. If you're not going with me, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go. But I like number 6. Reluctant men are often carried to victory by a brave woman. Happens in a lot of marriages, but let's get the principle first. Here is a reluctant man. And he says, I'm not going to. God had told him, you can do it. You go, and you can do it, and you'll win. But there were 2 women that carried him across the victory line. There were 2 women carried him across the victory line. They were brave women, apparently braver than he was. There's many a husband that don't have the courage to lead the family, and they're led across the victory line, and the family did well, and he gets the praise for it, for leading his family, when actually she was leading behind the scenes because he didn't have the courage to make any decisions. That happens in a lot of families. He's too scared to make a decision, so he throws that off to her, and she makes all the decisions. She has the brunt of that, but he smiles when everything went well. We raised our children. Look how, and it may have been her doing all the work, and it was this brave woman carrying him across the victory line. All right, that'll preach. Number 7, real faith to act when you don't have all you need to do the job by your own strength. Would you want to go against 900 chariots? When, if our interpretation be correct, that there's hard to find any weapons around? There was no way they're going to fight 900 chariots of their own strength. So that means that while he was hesitant, Barak had to have some faith, and especially did Deborah have strong faith. And then last of all, there will be victory when we let God choose the battle, the plan, the place, and the army. God chose the battle, He chose the plan, He chose the place, and He chose the army. And they were victorious. And God may have chosen your battle, your place, your plan, and you as a part of the army. And He may have chosen the victory for you as well. We'll stop at that note.